And then for everybody who's here too, I will record this talk just like I did the other ones, and hopefully this one will take less time to process as the other one is still processing. And I will post them up so that anybody who misses anything can see what they missed. And I had another one. Oh, we also have a keynote from Julia Waite. She's from, Sophie, help me out. Sprout, thank you. And
am I unmuted?
You are, but
apologies.
You were there, so you helped. And so she, time-wise, because she's in Australia, the keynote was at the bad time, so she recorded hers, and I will post the link, and everybody can watch it and be even more informed. So we all want you to learn and grow while you're here, not just make solutions that change the world. And so, give everybody a couple more minutes. There's still some people dropping in, and we'll get started in a minute. How is everybody's evening going so far? You can throw into the chat if you like what you guys are working on, if you have any questions, any confusion, any stuck points. I creepily see all of your chats, and so, which you might notice if I drop in and answer a random question. And so it looks like you all are doing wonderful work so far. Marcel is good so far.
Oh, yeah.
Good. Do we have
And the other one traumatized already. Oh no.
Hmm?
Yeah, the other one traumatized already. Just 2 hours.
Yeah. I spent an hour on the phone or like emailing back and forth on the chat with Discord to make sure that the channel would not overload. And they assured me that it wouldn't. Famous last words. So we've moved back over to Zoom, where happily we can have like 1,000 people or something ridiculous. So I'll probably put the rest of the talks on Zoom for the rest of the weekend. I will put all of the links everywhere that you could possibly want them, as well as be dropping them at you throughout the day for the next 2 days.
Yeah. It wouldn't be a real online event anyway without that kind of problems.
That's something being weird.
It has to be wrong.
Yeah, but at least instead of an in-person event, if the venue doesn't work, we can just make a link and move on. So I think we still have some people dropping in, but we seem to be mostly here. Mm-hmm. So I will introduce Paul, and he can kick off. So this is Paul Kileen. He is from the National Standards Authority of Ireland, otherwise known as the NSAI, and I'm going to let him take it away. So Paul, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I'm going to switch off my video now because I don't want to scare you for too long here. And I'm looking at a screen above me. So, okay, well, welcome everybody. As Caitlin said, I'm from NSAI. I'll talk to you about innovation and standards to help you have impact. So what's a standard? It's basically an agreed way of doing something with a community of experts, where you're experts there yourselves in your own teams. But then typically, standards is international groups get together to either develop technology, a product, service, a process, or whatever. And then it's an open process, transparent, voluntary, consensus-driven. So that's the summary of what it is. And then why would you be interested in standards? Well, they can help bridge the innovation gap between, let's say, research or lower TRL or technology readiness or early stage work and mass market adoption. Because these people here in the mass market, which is you, me, our brothers and sisters, whatever, they wouldn't know as much about blockchain or other emerging technologies. So if there's a standard and if your product or service is built on top of that standard, it gives them confidence to purchase. That's the kind of the theory and the summary of how it works, and it does work that way. And then there's groups like ISO, which you've probably heard about, International Standards Organization, and others that do that type of work. And then we're the National Standards Authority for Ireland. So anybody based in Ireland can plug in to the international system through the NSAI. that's the summary. So if you want to de-risk and accelerate and scale your company, this is one way of looking at it. At least build on top of existing standards at a minimum, and then potentially, get engaged in early standards development as well. It takes a bit of time, so you'd want to have a clear strategy of where you're doing it. So really, I suppose the summary is to get ahead of the curve. So here's your classical technology development life cycle, introduction, growth, maturity, decline. You're at the very beginning here, of course. This weekend, I understand, at the very early stages, have an idea. But what the leaders do in standards development, strategic, there can be startups. There are startups examples who've done this, many of them. SMEs, multinationals, of course, Microsoft were on earlier. They do a lot of this too. But to get ahead of the curve, you actively engage and get early into the standards development, provide technical contributions, build support for your proposals, get your ideas, and potentially intellectual property in terms of patents, potentially even, or just general ideas into the standard. And then the idea is to leverage your involvement. So if you get in early, you gain a time to market advantage from that. This is another view of the same thing. This is your innovation process this weekend with your groups. You're coming up with an idea here. Obviously, this weekend, you're not going to develop an international standard, but you're at the early stage here. But as you think about maybe scaling your company or bringing it forward, if you bring your idea forward after this weekend and start developing a product or a service and testing it and piloting it, then you can engage with this, I call it's an innovation platform, which is the international standards development process. You'll get a lot of insights from that on existing standards in the area or planned standards in that area. Then you can provide your inputs, get more insights, because the people at the table here are your potential future customers, competitors, governments, etc. So you'll gain a lot of insights. And as you're building your product service, by the time your product service comes out, if you've aligned it with the standard and you're based on top of the standard, that will help your business scale. So I suppose what not to do is do what these guys are doing. At least be aware of existing and emerging standards and regulations, because if you're not, when you come to the market, it could be the European market or whatever market, the customers inside the market might say, well, are you based on standards? Is your product, if it's a software product, is it going to be reliable? Is it going to fall over after we've, a few extra people on the call or whatever? Or if it's a regulatory environment, and ICT is actually, currently not that regulated, but it's going to be more so in the future with things like GDPR already in place, Cybersecurity Act, and a few others I'll talk about. So that's the general gist, is at least understand what exists. That's the main thing from my message today. Even if you don't get involved in standards development per se, at least understand what exists, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel and start again when you find out, oh, didn't do that. We have to rebuild from scratch. So the vision, I suppose, from an Ireland perspective is we want to be global innovation leader in Ireland. That's the national strategy. So one way to do that is get ahead of the curve, help set the standards, at least be aware as a minimum of the standards. And so it sounds like a big thing to do. It's, I suppose it's not a trivial thing, but there are companies that do it. Here are a couple of Irish SMEs. This company here, OpenNet, they sold recently for 185 million. So if anyone's interested in making 185 million, they were a startup a few years ago, quite a few years ago now, but they always did the strategic standards engagement and IP development on top of it. So they're a good example. Iona was a spin out from a university in TCD years ago, and that did it. But these are a spin out today from an Austrian university who basically are selling now to the likes of Netflix and YouTube, because they're built on a solid standard for video streaming using MPEG standards, and their product is a good, solid, and reliable product. And therefore, they've I think raised a couple of 30 million or something like that recently in venture capital, because the venture capitalists say, oh, these guys know what they're doing, and they're helping set the standards. And then there's a couple of examples there I won't go into, but right. So I was also asked to talk a little about how do standards and regulations work together. So I'll just focus on the top part of this triangle, this pyramid here. So here's maybe a regulation. For example, it might be GDPR, or might be this electronic ID regulation, or the Cybersecurity Act has just been enacted there last year, and it's going to have impacts. And these regulations have things like essential requirements of high-level requirements like, look after people's privacy, etc. That kind of high-level stuff, or for electronic ID, whatever it says, but it's high level anyway. And then what happens if they're European regulations, the European standards bodies, through experts like yourselves, develop what they call harmonized standards. And then the easiest way for a company to comply with the regulation is to basically, build on the standard and say that you're complying with the standard in your product. So that was general about innovation and standards. But if we look at the blockchain and supply chain, this is some slides I've taken from Fiona Delaney, who's going to be mentoring you this couple of days, I think. And Fiona is founder and CEO of Origin Chain Networks, a great startup company. And she's also very active in our National MIR Committee, our National Standards Committee, and related ISO Committee on Blockchain. Okay, and she's got a company called Origin Chain, which, as you can guess, has something to do with blockchain. And the example that, so Fiona is the editor of this new evolving standard from ISO Blockchain Committee. It's technical committee number 307, doesn't matter, but it's a technical committee, and they're the blockchain committee for ISO, and they're developing this technical report, and Fiona is the editor. But here's just a picture of a food supply chain. So here's your final product. What is it? It's what is it? Heritage apple and baby oat porridge or whatever. Yeah. So here's the baby, the fork or the spoon, and here's the farm. So you hear about the farm to the fork, and it goes through a lot of different people on the supply chain, different organizations, and to be certified as a organic or whatever type of product here that people will trust when they buy it. It would be nice if this could be on a blockchain, so that various people could look in on the blockchain. That's the big advantage of blockchain versus other kind of less transparent systems, I suppose. So if I'm let's say the regulator, who's basically the government, and I want to see, well, are you complying with all the regulations along this pathway, and have you done your audits and have you got your certificates? Well, if the right kind of data from those transactions is on the blockchain, then the regulator here can look in and see is this good? Or if I'm the mother or the father here buying the kid the food to eat, I can wand the barcode or whatever at the end of the chain here in the shop, and I can see the provenance or the origin chain of the product. So that's a nice example of a use case, and Fiona has led the development of the overall use case thing for ISO, and she's also leading the specific one on the food supply chain called Universal Farm Compliance. So if you have any questions on use cases and standards around that, talk to Fiona. But I suppose for all of these kind of things, in general, it's all about partnerships, isn't it? So this week you're partnering together, or this weekend you've got a few, I think, 4 or 5 or 6 or whatever on a team. So you have partnerships together there. But for this kind of let's say, big kind of a challenge use case we just looked at, you have quite a few stakeholders. You got the farm compliance authorities, which are the governments. You got the farming community themselves, the farmers. You got the IT sector. You got the government and the EU in terms of regulators and compliance and all that. So it's quite a few people they need to partner with. And we're seeing and we're talking at the moment, could we do that in implementation of that universal farm compliance in Ireland if we can get all the right people together? And so Fiona's involved in that. And then, this is a diagram that I'm not a software person, so I kind of half understand this. But here's your architecture diagram, and this is the way that Fiona and the ISO committee have decided to represent the generic architecture for a use case aligned with the kind of reference architecture of the other standards in the ISO blockchain groups. And here you can see some of the data is off the chain and some of it's on the chain. And knowing what you put on the chain and what you put off the chain is obviously important. Some maybe public network, other you might link to other blockchain or digital ledger technology or blockchain basically systems. So your non-DLT systems like your mobile app that the farmer will use on the farm, and then you log some of the information onto the blockchain. And of course, you need to think about who does what. So this is basically showing who are the different users, who are the different roles, what are they doing, and how are they doing it, more or less. So the use case standard or technical report describes a lot of different use cases. So it's a draft report at the moment, but again, any questions on that type of thing, talk to Fiona. Then one other thing we said we do is have a prize fee where ourselves and Fiona with Orange and Shane. So, you know, winning team over the weekend, Fiona's willing to mentor one of that team if they're interested in putting their use case forward for potential inclusion in this evolving draft standard on the blockchain use cases. Yeah. So fair play to Fiona. Thanks for that. And she'll do it obviously through the NSAI Murrah committee feeding into the ISO. Okay. So thanks Fiona for that one. And then here's a kind of a cheat sheet that Fiona put together based on the use case from ISO. So as you're doing your work, some food for thought as it were over the weekend, you know, maybe some things to think about. So these are kind of the headings in the use case template for the ISO. So if you are submitting a use case or independent of submitting the use case, these are the type of things you need to think about if you're doing blockchain implementations. You know, why blockchain? Is it all the different reasons there you can look at? Functional requirements, non-functional requirements, and kind of context things to think about, like the legal and regulatory stuff we talked about. If you're looking at ID management, identity management, obviously there's the GDPR, the EID regulation I talked about, et cetera, et cetera. So risk, think about those kind of things, business, technical, legal risk. It's not just the techie stuff. You know, legal, is it allowed or not? Or where's the legal, you know, where's the regs at the moment? What are the relevant existing standards? You know, there's lots of existing standards, like, you know, lots of like barcode standards, etc. So you need to integrate those. Then you can obviously look at how you're going to, what software you're going to use and what business model you're going to use, etc. And of course, interoperability for scalable solutions. A lot of people won't buy your product if it's not interoperable with some other key things, and standards is all about interoperability on the ICT side of things. So that's more or less it. Here's my little joke of Brexit trying to fit their square peg in a round hole. But any questions, I'm willing to take them. Hopefully that was of some use. I think I'll leave up the cheat sheet is probably the more useful thing for you over the weekend. So if there's any questions, I'll take them now, or I'll just pass over to whoever's next.
Excuse me. If anybody has any questions, feel free. You can turn your mic on and just shout them out, or you can drop them into the chat. And Paul answer. I think we also have Fiona here. Who got a
I think we have, yeah.
I saw you pop up in
I'm
there.
here, guys. Well done, Paul. That was great.
So if anybody has a question, feel free to shout out your question or hide behind a muted Zoom screen.
Is there anybody out there?
Can I, while you're all thinking of your awesome questions, can I talk a little bit about this cheat sheet, which probably at first glance doesn't look very cheaty at all. If you want me to, I'll explain it a little bit if that's a good idea.
Yeah, you can go for it, definitely.
Is that okay, Paul?
Oh, please do, yeah, Fiona.
Oh, there's a few requests. Please explain it. Okay. So these headings come from the template that we created at the ISO Use Case Lab. And the Use Case Lab is, it's formal in some senses, like it's a bit more formal than this group here. But for ISO standards development, we are considered to be complete mavericks. We completely engage with the blockchain community, the ecosystem. The fantastic thing about working with ISO is that it's truly a global community. So we have about 21 existing use cases, 22 if Korea have their way. They're trying to force another use case into the report before we go to publish it. So it's a little bit like the UN with all these different countries and national bodies competing for their say and their attention. So there's a kind of geopolitical aspect to it that, to be honest, in the use case lab, we tend to ignore. And we completely welcome use cases from all over the world, from all different types of implementations. They can be a proof of concept. They can be a full-blown enterprise. It can be like a DAO of DAOs for any of those super duper blockchain people there. It can be like really at completely different levels, and it won't matter at all if your use case hasn't gone beyond a proof of concept or even a prototype. If your idea is something that your team believes in, and if you would like to describe it and submit it to the ISO repository, I can't guarantee that it will be accepted into, it would be the next iteration of the report that would hopefully be published next year, because it is this democratic, global, international process. But it would appear in the ISO repository, and in the same way that, you know, like for the World Wide Web Consortium and requests for comments, in that open source way that technology is developed or the internet is developed, it completely happens within a community. And standards also, perhaps in a more formal way, but they too are open source, and they are created by the community, and particularly technical standards are developed by the community of engaged technical people from all over the world. And to have the opportunity to engage with that community, I can only tell you for myself, it has been very, very worthwhile. You meet people who, well, I'm a complete nerd, so I meet total nerds from all over the world, and we talk about not just about blockchain stuff, because at a certain level, that's kind of regular stuff. We talk about different applications. Like somebody I'm very friendly with now is developing a booking engine for influencers who live stream on Alibaba. And she's using blockchain technology to secure payment channels for those. There's this amazing project called WordProof, which is based in Holland, who I helped them, you know, write their reference architecture. And they recently, during COVID times, won a €1 million award from through Europe for Blockchain for Good, because they specifically said that their kind of fake news buster blockchain project could be used to combat fake news about COVID-19. And yeah, it's basically a plugin for WordPress and other CRM systems that uses a blockchain to create a tracking of an originality report and edit. It sort of creates a transparency around edits and updates. So yeah, like really, really amazing projects from all over the world. And it's really enlivening to meet people and to study the work and the research, not just research and work, but also things that happen in the marketplace. So people like you coming together, having a crack at something, coming across something that's like maybe, hopefully, maybe like really probably quite commercial, and having a go at it. And definitely in the use case lab, we're all about supporting that. So I don't know if you guys will think it's a good prize, but I definitely have found it a great community to be part of. So these things here, these under these different headings, these are sort of excerpts from the template that we created. And the why blockchain part comes from what we've called, it's a kind of horizontal category. It's sort of features that blockchain is good at. So in order to be using a blockchain, you have to identify everything. There's no other way, whether it's through wallets, whether it's through transactions, there's no other way to be an object or a subject in a blockchain without being identified. It doesn't have to be a personal identification, but identity management is a really big part of it. Data provenance, when we're talking about food supply chains, when we're talking about data integrity, like that WordProof project I spoke about, or you know, pharmaceutical supply chain stuff. Then there's things that I'm not an accountant, so I find it sort of boring. Like, what would you say, accounts receivable or something like that, but that's really basic stuff that once it's automated and streamlined, which you can do really successfully with smart contracts, simplifies and streamlines business processes and opens the door for machine to machine kind of control or participation in something like a supply chain or something like a business process. So I think we need to see ourselves as part of a future that we're arriving into, and blockchain is a big part of what can facilitate that. Governance, I'm not going to get too tucked into that, because that's really central to an effective blockchain enterprise. But when you're hacking something together, governance is quite possibly the last thing you think about. So I'm not really going to go into that. You can talk about that, you can not talk about that. In fact, you can talk about any of these things or none of these things. These are just ways of, I guess, categorizing the solutions that you're thinking about. Obviously, cryptocurrency and asset exchange, tokenization, all that's a really interesting concept and can have real value. The origins of it are from game theory and incentivizing actor behavior. We haven't really, I don't know of any real good use cases of that yet, I think there's an awful lot of market manipulation around cryptocurrencies and stuff. So I tend to stay away from it, even though you can see from something like the universal farm compliance, if you could be paid for good data integrity or something, a simple way to do that would be to introduce a cryptocurrency into that layer or into that enterprise. But it's so difficult to get everybody, all the partners on board, that I don't even start to have a conversation about tokens or cryptocurrency or anything like that. So definitely in Ireland, that's where we are. I have found, you might find that differently, or you might have different expectations, and that's perfectly fine, Then there's some other things around process optimization. I think I sort of mentioned that with the machine to machine stuff. You can think of it in that way. And automation, smart contracts basically automate execution, and that can have a real attraction. Of course, there's risks associated with it, and anybody who's used Solidity at all ever will have come across some of those risks. We can have war stories at the end, I suppose. Functional requirements, you probably all know what those are. Functional requirements are the specific technical requirements that your system that you are describing is going to need. And you, for the purposes of this weekend, you can go as far into that or as high level, I think, as you want. We've got a limited time, and I think you should all play to the strengths of your team. If you've got someone with software engineering background, you can maybe go a little further. And if you don't, I wouldn't worry about it too much. For example, the second one down there, use case models and UML. They're the little stickmen drawings. So you can say, maybe you've got a farmer, maybe you've got a compliance person, maybe you've got a consumer. And then there's a box, and that is your system. And that encompasses all the components, the back end, the front end, everything. It's a black box and it's your system. And then you draw little arrows into it to say what the actors are using your system for. So it's very abstract. It's not like you register or you press a button. It's like, the typical one is that for a bank machine, I want to get money out, I want to take money out of my account. You don't say, nobody ever wants to use a bank machine to key in their PIN number. That's not why we do it. It's a requirement for security, but it's not the functional requirement of the task that you have in hand. So non-functional requirements then would be more like security, performance, scalability, and interoperability, reliability. Anybody who's very familiar with, or even surface familiar with blockchain technology will know that there's a trilemma or a trade-off because of the way that it works. It's not always the fastest, and so it's not the most performant of technologies, and that can impact scalability and usability. And I I wouldn't expect a total newcomer to the scene to maybe understand a lot of that stuff. But if you do know about it, you can certainly make a comment that would be relevant and that would be of interest. And then this idea of the force field analysis, we have probably stretched to the limit what a force field analysis means in the use case lab, and we really mean it to mean the business context. If you're talking about legal constraints, like contract, human labor, freedom to operate. I mean, if you're setting up some kind of a, like, you know, software developers always like to solve problems really quickly. And we might see blockchains or cryptocurrencies as a really great way of facilitating payments, but know nothing about central banks or licenses or all of that kind of stuff. So there's a context, and to be taken seriously, just a surface dip into the water of naming what some of those constraints might be is a good idea, you know. Risks, what you consider the risks to be. Can I think of a good example here? So business risks would be how quickly or how easily it would be for somebody else to copy your idea, I suppose. Technical risk, let's talk about it, let's name it. Blockchain is a relatively immature technology, so that is a risk. If you think that you're going to sell to governments or big enterprise customers, you're going to have a problem with the reputation of the technology, just from a maturity modeling point of view. And you know, you can name that or not name it, but it's definitely a business constraint, I would say. Legal appears here twice, but I think there can be legal risk as well. Relevant standards, that can mean whatever you want. I mean, we're talking cybersecurity standards, we're talking cloud computing standards, we're talking, you know, any number of standards that may or may not be worth mentioning. As Paul noted earlier on, there's, I don't always use GS1, the unique barcode people, which are used by pharmaceutical companies and the whole of the food supply chain, particularly in cross-border trade, would be identified using typically unique barcodes that are often, most often probably provided by GS1. They also have standards around data exchange and a bunch of other stuff. And that, if you're talking about the security of the food supply chain, is something that's worth having a look at. They've also done a number of blockchain projects in Europe and the US and in other territories that might be worth tapping into. I definitely know they've had one with Carrefour, so I don't know if our friend Matthew had anything to do with that. But yeah, there's some really interesting projects out there. If you're thinking of using a mobile app, like a mobile app, and scanning something, you're probably going to scan, definitely for a demo, you're probably going to scan a QR code. You don't have to use a unique one. You can use whatever you find anywhere if you're building a demo like that. But it would be worth naming. You know, if we're talking about a secure food supply, you would need to think about stuff like that. And then open source versus proprietary software. I mean, we build on open source all the time. I'm a big fan of open source. We don't open source everything that we build or we make, but we definitely would honor that tradition very much. And we exist in that environment. And I think a lot of the blockchains, if you're going to use any, Hyperledger's open source, Ethereum's open source, there's a bunch of different stuff there that is really usable and have great communities with great, you know, great people who'll answer questions and all that kind of thing. So it's an absolutely superb place to start. And then any other info is absolutely what it says, whatever you want to say, whatever is relevant about your use case, whether you can say it's your secret sauce, or you can say it can be about your team, it can be about absolutely anything, you know. So yeah, I waffled on a little bit there, but if anybody has any questions, or I see Grania said new metadata. So there's a new, I think that means the new GS1 digital link, I think.
I'm not sure.
New metadata.
Hi.
So, Grania?
Fiona, that was about the WordPress plugin that you mentioned about the providing this. Yeah, that was that. Sorry.
Wordproof. It's called
Metadata or not.
Wordproof.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's great. Really great project.
I thought that anyway. Moment is gone. It's okay.
Okay, thanks, Grania.
Cool. We have one question as well. So I'll have this be our last question for the night, since some of you probably want to get back to working. I assume all of you want to get back to working, and this is our last scheduled thing for the evening. So considering that there might be mission critical data that is hard to decentralize, as in the data is hard to be verified by other peers in the blockchain, are there ways to circumvent that?
There's lots of ways to circumvent it, and verification on a blockchain doesn't mean that the other nodes verify the integrity of the data. They just verify, usually it's something like the ordering of the data. You can add extra requirements, but it would be, you know, is it timely, or is it a certain, you know, volume or byte size or that kind of thing. But it's a blockchain itself doesn't validate the content of a transaction. So I'm not sure if that totally answers your question, but if you want to, there's a ton of different ways that you can do pre-validation of data. So if in your business critical circumstance, and let's say you want to write the refrigeration history of cold storage or something like that, you could validate that data off chain, and when it is validated, that package or packet is what you would write to the chain. I'd love to be able to say your name. Is it Cow Duarte? Co Duarte? Does that answer your question? Not sure.
I hope so.
Cowie.
Okay. Fabulous. It does. Thank you. Perfect.
Awesome.
So for everybody, Fiona is also going to be speaking tomorrow, and she's in the Discord, so you can ping her with questions about the cheat sheet. Paul, is it okay if I drop these slides into the Discord as well, so that everybody can look back at them?
Yeah, it's fine. I'll probably PDF them for you to make it easier, and then I'll send the PDF. Yeah.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. So you'll have all of that information. I'll also drop this video into our YouTube and then into the Discord, so that you have it to refer back to as well. And so this is the last scheduled thing that we have for today. You're more than welcome to continue working in your channels either tonight or tomorrow morning or both. And I encourage you to do so. I'll keep my Discord open until about 10:30 tonight, and I'll put it back open tomorrow at 9. So if you have any questions until then and after then, feel free to ping me and ask. And if you want to just send me a message, not during one of those times, then I will get back to it as soon as possible. So I would, so continue working either tonight or tomorrow morning. I would recommend to have your problem statement pretty well pinned down by the time we come back tomorrow at 11 sharp. We'll have Saoirse Mulligan speaking and Juarez, which we will have working slides this time because we fixed the problem. And I think that's it. We're going to come back to Zoom tomorrow. So just in order to avoid the issues with Discord, I will send you all links to Zoom meetings for all of the talks tomorrow. And for the rest of the weekend, so that we can just avoid any problems and stick here on a platform that is nice and smooth and we know it's going to work. That's everything. Great work for the first day. And we're looking forward to having you back tomorrow. And thank you again, Paul and Fiona, for jumping in and sharing with us all of this wonderful information. So thank you, everybody, for being here. And
Legend.
we look forward to seeing you all tomorrow.
Thanks,
Have a
Caitlin.
great
Thanks.
night.
Bye.
If you like
Thanks,
it,
everybody.
have a
Thanks,
question.
Fiona. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.